I am Lauren Branston. I'm the CEO of the Institute of Business Ethics, and I am delighted to be joined today by Fraser Simpson from the Wellcome Trust, who's going to talk us through and all about a puppet called Connie that has transformed your approach to communicating ethics at the Wellcome Trust. Welcome, Fraser.
Thank you, and thanks, Lauren, to you and the team for having me. Really looking forward to having the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. We've had a fantastic number of people from all around the world sign up to listen to you and to hear about your journey with Connie. Before we get started, could you tell me just a little bit about you, your role, and a bit about the Wellcome Trust would be great too, if you could.
Yeah, happy to. And so for those that don't know the Wellcome Trust, we are a global charitable foundation based in the UK. We have a vision of a healthier future for everyone, and we try to move towards that vision through funding research and in the sort of medical and scientific space, and engaging and influencing others within that space. We therefore are politically and financially independent, and that gives us a pretty unique ability to deliver on our purpose. My background, I'm actually a lawyer by trade. I've grown up from working in the corporate sector, but spending most of the last 20 years working in the charity and not-for-profit space. I'm currently on internal secondment at Wellcome actually to lead our strategy team. But for the time I've been here, I've been responsible for designing and building out what has become our sort of organizational integrity function. We call it ethics, governance, and compliance. And that's really led me to the development of our refreshed code of ethics and the fun we've had creating Connie to help us really change mindsets in the organization around ethics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I started as the CEO of the Institute back in September, so 6 months ago. And at that time, I couldn't help but see Connie popping up everywhere, this kind of, bright pink puppet. And I've always been passionate about the role of creativity in ethics and really also the overlay of ethics with innovation and innovative cultures. And so we immediately kind of connected, and this has resulted in this webinar today. So I'm delighted to have you here. The puppet is an extraordinary kind of creation, but I would love you to take us back to that moment when you first perhaps had the idea that using a puppet would be the best way to solve some of the challenges that you were trying to solve at that moment in time. Can you tell us a bit about that moment when you decided this is the way you were going to go?
Yeah, I very happy to. And I guess what sort of important context to that is what were we trying to solve? And I think one of the pieces that I see, and one of the frustrations I have with the law and lawyering in its sort of general terms is that quite often we as lawyers see a document as somehow a solution to behavior change, that the creation of a contract or a policy or whatever it happens to be will result in something happening. Whereas actually, in the reality is very often that when it comes to human behaviours, a policy might be essential, but actually is insufficient to driving a human behavioural response. Something more than that is needed. Some element of engagement, some element of providing people the opportunity to actually behave in a particular way. And so, what I wanted to do was to address the challenge of producing a written code or a written policy, but actually, how do you make that actionable? How do you use that as a catalyst for behaviors? And for me, that talks to capturing people's mindsets, getting something going from perhaps important but boring, and therefore I won't engage, to, I get why this is important. I can see why this matters, or even this is fun. And therefore I'm going to start acting in a different way. And so that was really the nugget of what we were trying to solve. So what I was trying to look for was how do you engage people that perhaps don't care in a topic, to the extent that they're willing to change their behaviors. And so what I wanted to explore was emotional connection, human connection, humor. Um, the moment around that ended up in a puppet was actually a realization that characterization was a very human way of making connection and engagement. And I think, you know, I'm in the fortunate position of having two young children. I see that every day in what they watch on TV, what they read, how they learn. And I experience it myself. I experience human connection with the sorts of things that they do as well. Um, what really brought it home, though, is as an anecdote, every Friday to my team, I send a note on a Friday afternoon, usually with some sort of amusing picture or a meme, and wish everybody a happy Friday at 4:30. And one particular Friday, I did that having just bought a new vacuum cleaner. I'd given my kids the choice of whether we bought Henry the Hoover or Hetty the Hoover. And for those that don't know, Hetty the Hoover, it's a pink coloured vacuum cleaner with a face on it and big eyelashes. And so I sent my team a picture of me sat next to Hetty the Hoover on the sofa and said, "Oh well, perhaps it's date night for me." And of course, it generated this enormous response. So normally a few people would respond in a joking way. The whole team thought this was hilarious, and that was a moment for me where I thought, okay, a character is a way of connecting with people, generating a response. Let's explore that. But in parallel, we'd been working with a quite brilliant communications and learning agency who had a similar concept, and we brought those ideas together, and out of that really worked up this notion that we could characterize a conscience, and that's what grew into a pink puppet.
I love that phrase, characterize a conscience. That's fantastic. And I love humor. You know, I think it does unite people. There's a way of it kind of brings people together. If you're all laughing at something
Yeah,
together, I mean, there is a need to ensure that you don't alienate anyone in that process, or you don't kind of, exclude anyone from the
absolutely.
joke, I guess. And so when you were kind of thinking about this and kind of thinking about, okay, great, so we're going to do a puppet because you sent the meme, and I love the fact that you send a meme to your team at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon. But were there hesitations? How did you think about the kind of risks involved? I imagine, that idea is quite countercultural to the culture of the Wellcome Trust, so how did you not get scared off? How did you
Yeah.
maintain your bravery in the face of kind of managing some of those risks around that creative nucleus of an idea?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It would be very easy to get scared off. But I think when you have to be sort of personally invested and see the potential. We have as a value within our organization bravery, which I think is a fantastic value to have. And that talks to us wanting to push the curve and to try different things, which is very helpful. But yes, it takes a bit of a leap of faith. But I think you can work with colleagues to take soundings. Is this really mad? You can work with people outside of the organization to reassure you that you're on the right track. But I think when it comes to risk, people always see risk. They always look at it as a downside thing rather than an upside thing. What's the risk of it not being brave? Well, the risk of not being brave is we'd have produced another policy that would have blended in with the noise, that relatively few people would have read and would have become largely unactionable. And that's a far bigger risk than trying something and it not working. We figured, we could create something, and the risks were, people might say we were trivializing some important issues, or that it was somehow childish or too mad. But actually, our objective was to get people talking about things. And I figured that actually, whatever happened, people were going to talk about it. So it wasn't too much of a downside for people to say this is silly, because they were still talking about it. And I think thinking about risk in that way is quite helpful.
So interesting. And I think often ethics and compliance are bedfellows, they sit alongside each other. And I think about compliance as the rules and ethics as imagination. And actually, the Institute has got a long history of advising companies on codes of ethics and what does a quality code, what are the dimensions of a quality code, and communications and the ability of the code to really engage emotionally and embed in the culture is fundamental to the success and effectiveness of that code. And so we review codes for people, and we make recommendations about how they can make them more engaging, more relevant, more interesting, more kind of effective ultimately. But what you've done, I think, in your work, genuinely, Fraser, is kind of shift the window entirely, raise the bar completely on the creativity element of that, and so we can point to what you've done as an example of that, which is way beyond, really what is considered sort of the norm within codes of ethics. And I think, that's extraordinary. The reaction to the code, to just tell me a little bit about, the reaction that you've received to this. It's been pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very lucky in that it's a character that captures the imagination of pretty much anyone that sees it. So we've had a pretty huge reaction internally, which has been great, and of course was the intention. But it's also just through sort of posting out on social media really generated an enormous response from actually a number of different communities, both the ethics compliance community, also the learning and development community, who I think can sort of see this behavioural approach in a number of different spaces, and also the legal community. So I think that's been really impactful. But what's been, I think, two reflections have been really interesting for me on that reaction. One has been from those who genuinely look beyond the puppet to why does this approach work? It doesn't have to be a puppet. It's how do you engage your particular audience, and that could be any number of methods of delivery, and that could work in different spaces. So it doesn't have to be just around ethics. It could be around other types of behavior change. I think that's really interesting. The other has been the global spread of response, and we had deliberately designed Connie to be incredibly inclusive across our organization. But I don't think I'd appreciated at the outset how well that would translate across global cultures. I think there's something innate about a characterized puppet that simply connects with human beings wherever they are.
Yeah, and I'm presuming that most people who've signed up for the webinar have seen Connie,
well,
but
should we bring Connie in?
yes,
Because
please.
here is Connie. This is our sort of static version of Connie. But you can see, for those who are struggling to see, we've got a pink face puppet with glasses. And the only real indicative feature of them being from Wellcome is that they have their own staff pass. Which really talks to the fact that we've tried to embed Connie as being one of our colleagues. So Connie was announced to our organization as being recruited into the team, has their own email address, has their own profile on our intranet page, just like any other staff member.
Perfect. Hi, Connie. Good to meet you. And but tell me, because okay, we just could spend. I want to talk to Connie now, but no. So tell me about the execution of the idea, because I think that's where, for me, in one of our early conversations, I was really blown away by kind of just the excellence that you have pursued in the execution of this. And also kind of how did you decide, from a communications perspective, what Connie was allowed to say and not allowed to say? I'm really interested in kind of in that approach around messaging and bringing it to life in a convincing way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, all credit goes to the organization we worked with, Action, for the execution. Who they're quite astoundingly brilliant group of people who are not only smart but incredibly creative and kind too. Who really helped us through the design and a lot of co-creation of how we do things. But it was very important to us the execution really worked well. Because we didn't want this to look like, you know, something handmade in the garden shed, but for this to be actually something that was very credible. And I think they've really helped us as to do that, and we've been very thoughtful in the way we did that, talking to our values around inclusion, making sure that we were producing the you know, for example, the code of ethics documents. We've produced easy read versions that people can hold, feel, and touch. We've produced versions of those in high contrast for those of our staff that have visual impairment. We produced Braille versions. We went very large on launching the engagement with our staff through a video where Connie introduces themselves by sort of smashing out of the screen when we take the mickey out of one of our own compliance webinars. So we invested quite a lot in that. What was your second question? Sorry, Lauren. It was
so I was interested in it. So just coming back on the execution piece, but you have someone who acts out, who brings Connie to life.
Absolutely. So we actually have two Connies. Don't tell Connie that. So there's one that is a puppet that is used by a puppeteer. And Jess, who's quite incredible, was part of was a creative director at Avenue Q, the musical, who really brings the character to life and provides the voice. And then we have this second one, who's the one sat next to me at the moment, because we wanted to have a physical puppet that was with us in the office. And so this one is wired up, and we can use that for a variety of things within our office as a real visible symbol of the code of ethics. And I think that's really important as well, because it gives us so much agility and flexibility as to how we can introduce ethics just into everyday mundane things.
Yeah, amazing. No, so the second part of my question, sorry, that's a trick I have, is you know, asking 3 questions in one. So apologies. So the second part of the question was really around, how did you come up with, you know, my first sort of question is like a Q&A, or like what's Connie allowed to say and not allowed to say? Well, how do you manage that? You know,
I mean, I think that and it's really difficult because it also talks to what Connie can do, because Connie is your conscience, and so Connie's role is to ask a set of provocative questions that we put in our code of ethics, designed to help you rationalize the right behavior in moments that matter, where something isn't prescribed by law or policy. But it's very important, therefore, that Connie has a consistent tone, a trusted tone, and is you know, professional, engaging, but also friendly, smart, confident, fun. And that has to come through in the content of what they say, but also the tone of how they say it, both in writing and in spoken form. But also visually. You know, there's so much fun that you want to have with creating a character. Wouldn't it be lovely if we started to do a series of spoofs of Connie getting into scrapes? But actually, that doesn't fit with being a conscience. So we've got to always be mindful that we're not bringing that character into the places that a conscience shouldn't go, because what we're talking about here is being a guiding character that helps you to make the right decisions, as opposed to one that does and says things in an uninclusive or a unthoughtful way.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I think you said at one point that Connie wasn't allowed to be naughty. Is that true?
Well, not publicly.
Fantastic.
But you know, everybody's conscience, I'm sure, would have their off moments. But we try very deliberately to make sure that whilst this is a playful character, it's playful in a constructive way that aligns with our code of ethics, as opposed to breaking free and being renegade.
Fantastic. No, that makes a lot of sense. And the kind of sense that you have of like how Connie sort of takes on a life of their own, really, you know, where's where's Connie going? Like, how do you keep Connie fresh? How do you maintain the creativity once you've created a character like this? You
Yeah.
know, where are you now with Connie in relation to perhaps where you were when you first started? How has that shifted?
Yeah, I think again, there's a few levels to this because at one level you can create a character and it's a gimmick, it's a piece of branding, and it's designed to capture attention in the moment. What we wanted to do was to go much deeper than that. Well, what we wanted to do was to create a colleague, and so we went deeper with creating the intranet profile that enabled you to dig down into who their character is. So we put out, within the profile their favorite songs on YouTube and all these sorts of things to make them accessible and fun. We also built out email functionality, so their email address becomes our intake for ethics and compliance questions from staff. But we also use that as a method of sending out our new version of ethics training, which was to get away from annual e-learning and into monthly dilemmas. And so we've branded those now as Connie's Ethics Gym to flex your ethical muscle. And every month, all of our staff get a multiple choice ethics dilemma sent by Connie, written in the style of Connie, and branded as such. And almost instantaneously, because it's a click of a button on an email response, they can pick their choice and get feedback that shows them where they are relative to the rest of the organization, because it shows you a pie chart of everybody's responses, and also a worked example back from Connie, which is always, goodness, this is difficult because the policies don't cover it. We're in a grey area, a moment. It's a moment that matters, and you're right to be thinking about it. And by doing it through Connie's lens, we're able to, in a vulnerable way, unpack all of the different nuance, the different contexts that might take any individual staff member in a different direction when assessing what their response might be. And I think that's quite powerful in making learning interesting and fun, and in fact not feel like learning at all. And what we're getting there is very high response rates on something that's voluntary, whereas before we were getting lower response rates on something that was mandatory. And I think what we're doing is reinforcing the thought process of, oh, this is hard. I need to look at the policies to see if there's any guardrails. Oh, there aren't. How do I now apply the core questions within the code of ethics, which we frame as, does this fit with our beliefs and values? What are the risks? What would your colleagues think? What would the public think? And does it feel right? And we sort of feel that actually, if you consciously and honestly ask yourself those questions, the chances are you're going to get to a good answer.
Yeah.
So I think that's been really good in building out the character. But we've had fun because the character's been able to leverage tone from the top. So we had a week, for example, where the chair of our board, Julia Gillard, was away on leave, and very cheekily put Connie in her chair. And what better way to demonstrate tone from the top to the organisation on ethics than to have the conscience sat in the chair of the board's office for everybody to see. We've also had fun using the puppet physically. We did, for example, a staff charity quiz, and a smarter colleague than I came up with the great idea that Connie could join the judging panel of the quiz. And it was fascinating because a number of the staff who were on that judging panel came back and said, God, I really felt under pressure to do the adding up right because Connie was there looking over my shoulder. So there's those fun things, but we're also now taking Connie, further, and using them in other arenas. So one of the pieces that we're about to do is to use Connie to help with decision making and taking thoughtful choices around sustainability. And there's so much that you can play with once you have this sort of asset.
It's so interesting. And going back to the ethical dilemmas that you're posing, in a way, you're kind of shifting the code of ethics to an ethical decision-making model and then
Yeah.
using Connie to bring that to life. And to what extent, when you're going through the development of the ethical dilemmas, are you are you doing really kind of theoretical dilemmas, or are you starting to move into that space of kind of real dilemmas for the Wellcome Trust? Because in a way,
Yeah.
you could start to evolve principles and perhaps policies out of that work. And I'm just interested in kind of,
Yeah.
how imagined or real those situations
I mean,
are.
we've started with some pretty real ones, but pretty simple ones, because what we wanted to
Mhm.
do was to do things that people could engage with that felt very relevant. But I
Yeah.
agree with you; it's exactly the sort of platform that you could use as
Yeah.
an internal thought leadership piece. And you're exactly right when in the sort of build up to that. One of the pieces I think it's important to emphasize is that what we very deliberately tried to do here was to flip the traditional approach to compliance. And the traditional approach to compliance in most organizations is to say to our staff, and I'm emphasis for effect, but to say to our staff, you're all idiots, you don't know what to do, and you need to be trained. And therefore, here's an e-learning, and by the end of it, you'll know what to do. And of course, the reality is very different because we don't recruit idiots. Actually, our colleagues at Wellcome are really smart people, and they all want to do the right thing. So what we're doing is we're flipping the narrative to say, actually, we've got good people. We think that you want to do the right thing. We think that actually inside your head, most of the time, you know the right thing, but we recognize that it's difficult. And so we've got a set of policies and guidance that covers off the red lines. And then within the
Yeah.
red lines where it's difficult, what we need to do is to help empower you with something that's actionable. Um,
Yeah.
you're never going to remember 300 policies, but you are going to remember what would Connie do. And if you remember what would Connie do,
Fantastic.
you might remember that you've got this hanging on your desk that poses you those 5 questions. And if you answer those honestly, the chances are we're in good shape. And I think that's a very pragmatic approach to something that becomes real and actionable and therefore impactful.
And what I love about that is that you are effectively, you're saying the people who work here have got the motivation and the capacity to do this, but I am increasing their capability.
Yeah,
And in doing so, to be ethical leaders
yeah,
effectively. And in doing so, you're increasing the
yeah,
ethical culture because an awareness of the culture and embedding that in the culture because everybody is on the same
yeah,
journey. And that would move me to a question around evaluation and measurement, because I think that's also
yeah,
really interesting. Like, how do you know that this is having a positive impact?
yeah.
What are you kind of what are you having to report back
Yeah.
about all of this?
Well, let me come to that. I'll just do one reflection because one valid challenge of this approach would be, well, you're never going to stop the bad actor.
Okay.
What's this going to do? And I think my reflection on that would be, nor is the overwhelming policy environment with an attempt at creating an incredibly robust control framework. You're still going to get bad actors fall through that net. What we're doing here is I think being pragmatic about shifting the curve, rather than pretending somehow that anything could ever be 100% effective at eliminating unethical behavior.
No, absolutely. And I suppose to my mind, eliminating unethical behavior at 100% is
Yeah,
unrealistic. But what
exactly.
you are doing is encouraging a
Yeah,
culture where people feel confident, able to
exactly.
speak up, to kind of, constructively challenge,
Yeah,
to think about these
yeah,
kinds of issues that need careful thought
yeah,
and
yeah,
consideration. And ethics is a skill, it's a
yeah.
practice that needs to be developed over time. So what you're doing is strengthening that muscle within the organization, which I think is genius,
And,
frankly.
and that word you had of confidence is exactly it. It's confidence to spot the issues, and it's confidence to tackle the issues, and confidence
Mm,
even just
mm,
to talk about those. But in
yeah.
terms of success measures, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
what we set out at the start, with was not a particularly sort of quantitative set of KPIs. We set a broad objective as to say, well, what we really want here is to be sparking conversations that otherwise wouldn't have been happening. What we wanted is for these sort of ethical topics to be on the agenda rather than being, that's difficult and hard, we won't talk about it, it'll sit in a policy on SharePoint. Was actually wanted to be hearing those and facilitating those conversations, because it's through that that people start grappling with nuance, and you understand where organizational tolerances are and should be. And so yes, we measure that in certain ways. So we look at the number of team meetings that we're now invited to attend to rather than begging to join. And we still monitor, we still have a suite of e-learning on specific areas where there is a skill gap that we're looking to close. And so we still obviously do all of that sort of tracking. And we also provoke broader conversations across the organization through ethics events. But I think there's a really important piece that's really hard to measure, and it's about feel and buzz within an organization. And it's that bit of, can you hear those issues being grappled with? And I love it when I'm in the queue at the canteen and I can hear people say, "What would Connie do?" or those sorts of things. And it's that's very hard to measure, but is really important because it means you're getting cut through. The issues are now above the horizon rather than below it. And that for me is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the power of creativity in driving behavior change in any topic, including ethics, is that creativity brings attention, and attention brings energy and focus. And that's where things then start to move, change, innovate, and so no, that really does resonate. And I love what you said about getting conversations starting that otherwise might not have happened. I think that's a great measure of success. Yeah. Probably very different from other metrics that that other organizations might be
Yes,
measuring.
it's hard to bring it into a nice dashboard for an audit committee, but it's really important.
It is exactly. And so yeah, so many questions at this point. But so for me, I kind of feel like there might be some people watching, listening in, and we have had one question on this actually in the Q&A, which is around the cost of all of this. So, this is great, but how much does it actually cost to do this? And how much time and resource did it take? And I just wondered if we could get your thoughts on that, Fraser.
Yeah, so I mean, my response is not as much as you'd think, and I can compare that because we previously, 5 years before, launched the what we then called it the Code of Conduct, and we did a launch where we created a video of vox pops from staff across the organisation and all of that sort of stuff, which costs more in terms of time and resource. What we did here, yes, we nevertheless spent money on this. There's no escaping that. But what we did was to work with some really professional people that were able to do a huge amount of creativity on actually what's quite a small budget. But I think one of the really important things I'd like to focus on is the potential longevity we have here. One of the challenges we had when we used our own staff to talk about ethics was that staff have a habit of leaving. And of course things come out of date quite quickly, and people look at your videos and say, well, who on earth are those people, and why is there now a different CEO? What we have here is a non-human interface that can develop with the organization but stays with the organization, and so we've been able to sort of budget this as an exercise over 5 years, and I think we'll get a lot of life out of that. But not only do we get the code of ethics, but we've got a method of then starting to talk about other difficult things. And so there's a real agility in the horrible term for Connie, an asset, but in the asset we've created, because we can be flexible in how we start to use that. And so I think there's real value in there over the long term. But yes, it certainly took some money. It took some time, from start to finish. I think we spent about 6 months from the initial idea to deployment of the whole thing, and that covered the rearticulation of the code of ethics. It covered the creation of the character and the development of all the launch materials.
Really interesting. And what advice would you have? So for are the people listening in, who some of which, and a lot of them are leaders in ethics, or ethics leaders interested in ethics, or they are actually leading ethics in their organizations. What advice would you have for people kind of thinking about using creativity in this sphere? What would be kind of maybe your watch outs or your words of wisdom or encouragement on kind of should I
Yeah.
push the envelope, so to speak, you know, and do something different, take a risk, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the primary reflection is that ethics is a human thing. It's about people,
Yeah.
and so central is engaging people. Now, how you do that depends on your organization, your people, what's brave, where the boundaries might be, what the culture is. So, you know, what might be right for one organization might not be right for another. So, you know, I certainly wouldn't think that a pink puppet would be, you know, appropriate for, you know, some sort of, you know, crusty financial institution, for example. Perhaps it's exactly what they need. But it's around identifying the right mechanism for that will engage your people. So it's thinking from that sort of user experience lens, I guess, as to what might work, but what also might provide a bit of challenge because you want to stand out. And I think my main advice would be have a go because there's nothing to lose. Um, and the you know the folks I work with at Action, James, who's become a great friend through doing this, has this lovely phrase. He says, you know, it's not about thinking outside of the box. It's about realizing that there isn't a box.
Yeah, definitely.
And you know, just try that. What is there to lose? Because what you might gain is massive engagement. And there's so
Yeah.
many ways of doing this. We've seen
Mm.
other ways work brilliantly where people have used, you know, rhetorical devices like, you know, analogy to be able to describe things. So I've seen one organization did their entire data protection training through an analogy with looking after a baby instead of looking after data. Instantly much more
Yeah.
engaging than
Brilliant.
we're going to talk to you
Yeah.
about GDPR, and every human being
Yeah.
switches off. Um, we've seen health and safety, where another organization transposed their health and safety policy and procedures into the song lyrics and style of Barry White, and then produced a music video with the UK's leading Barry White impersonator. And it's
Fantastic.
extraordinary. And the ability to capture people's attention, mindset, and therefore enable behavior change is huge. Contrast that with his version 4.7.1 of the Code of Ethics, please read, sign, and return. It's
There's,
night and
there's
day.
there's no comparison. No,
And
it's
the
interesting.
policy update approach is never going to cause behavior change. At best, you're going to tick a box that everybody's read it, but that is
Yeah,
never
yeah.
going to actually shift the dial on what we're all here about, which is stopping people falling off the cliff in the first place.
And yeah, that's so interesting. And I think that whole piece of like how do you what's within the realms of acceptable within the culture of the organization,
Yeah,
and how do you think about going to the edge of that
yeah,
perhaps and pushing that a little bit wider, but not
and
going
perhaps just a bit
outside.
beyond the edge.
You're just a bit beyond the edge. Yeah, yeah, no,
And certainly,
really.
you know, for us, you know, we're a brave and free thinking organization, but there's no doubt in my mind that creating a pink puppet did push our
Yeah,
organization beyond its comfort zone. Um,
yeah,
and you know, there's always a challenge back around, well, but this isn't, you know, this isn't on visual brand. I think another piece that's really important is if you want to be heard, sometimes you've got to go off brand. Sometimes if
mm,
you want to be heard, you can't blend in with the noise.
no,
And of course, everybody can't do that because then it would
no,
be, you know, then it would be sort of car crash jazz.
yeah,
But every now and then, if there's something important, it's helpful to stand out a bit.
yeah. And what have been some of the lessons learned for you? What kind of has perhaps you might have done differently if you were doing it again? You know, where for you do you feel like there's been some learning?
I think the learning is that being brave is a good thing, and acting on that is a good thing. I think treating people on ethical issues respectfully and that way of shifting the narrative has really taught me that, you know, people do want to engage in these things.
Yeah,
On the whole, I'm sure there are those that don't, but on the whole, people do want to be treated as an adult and do value being empowered to make choices, and that does work. I think that's been really valuable. Um, I think also it's shown areas where we could even be it'd be nice to think further where we might take this. And we've got pieces where I wasn't yet brave enough to go, but perhaps the organization might be braver, or not. I don't know. So, for example, we've created an AI chatbot called iConnie, that's a Teams-based chatbot. We held way back from trying to develop that as being something that could, answer your ethical dilemmas, or your ethical questions. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was that that was actually quite hard to do. Another was that we didn't want it to give the wrong answers, because that would be a bit problematic. But the chat bot said I could. And the other was around, actually, we didn't want to allow our staff to outsource answering the hard questions, because
Absolutely.
that
No,
takes away the
no.
accountability. But I think there's
Yeah.
something in there around, actually, how far could you take a chatbot? The other
And we,
piece, the other piece that I think will be interesting to explore is around the use of a character in relation to speak up mechanisms. One thing we've noticed, there was a great example for I think last year, on X, or Twitter as it was. Elmo tweeted, "How are you?" And within a minute, you know, hundreds of millions of the global X population opened their hearts to Elmo in a way they never would, to to Biden or Trump or Obama, or frankly anyone else. And there's something about a humane but non-human connection. And I wonder whether there's something around using Connie as being a speak to Connie, in relation to our speak up mechanism. We haven't dared explore that.
no,
That
that's
would have just been too
interesting.
much to do, and it might not
Yeah.
work. But I think it'd be something that would be interesting to explore.
Yeah, really interesting. And back to the point on an AI chatbot, I find that slightly mind-boggling, and we
Mm,
are having that conversation in our supporter networks, where we have conversations around ethics and challenges and raising standards of
yeah,
around ethics in organizations. People are starting to ask that question, like what could be the role for answering
yeah,
AI generated responses around ethical dilemmas. And I'm kind of like, oh, okay, that's a kind of Pandora's box. That's
it
definitely a
is.
whole other webinar. It's kind of like, wow, okay. But on speak up, yeah, very interesting. And that sort of the disarming nature of a puppet, and kind of
Yeah.
how it doesn't, because in a way, what and you've said this already, but what I love about Connie is that it's so inclusive. It
Mm,
resonates across culture. They I should not say the
yeah.
it. So
And we very deliberately, to how can you be inclusive? Well, and part of that is by being more diverse than the entire of your diversity.
yeah,
And
yeah,
therefore
absolutely.
everybody is included.
Yeah, no, which I love. And I've got a couple more questions for you.
Mm.
But one was to bring Connie back on screen again, because I kind of
Oh,
want to see them again. Oh, there we go. See, look, I mean, literally, it just makes me smile. I mean, hi, Connie. No, the question I have is if really about, and it's a question I want to ask more of people that I'm doing webinars with, which is, what do you think when I say what is ethics? And I think you've touched on this already, but what would Connie say if I asked Connie what is ethics? On a very basic level, what would Connie say?
well, for a start, Connie's saying that's an incredibly difficult question.
Brilliant.
But
I
I,
love
I
that.
think I think what Connie would say is, it's really around enabling human beings to act in a good way in moments that matter. Being able
Mm,
to recognize those and to be able to decide good decisions and choose good choices.
brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Connie. And I love the way Connie's expressed that so clearly. I'm really warming to Connie a lot.
It's hard not to.
It is hard not to. It's hard
Albeit
not to.
every now and then there are people that have slight issues with puppets. So we do have to be careful every now and then.
Okay, no, that's brilliant. And finally, I wanted to ask really about kind of you've touched on the sort of the where next for Connie, but
Mm.
I just wanted to go a little bit more. You mentioned the sustainability element. What are you thinking about from that perspective? Because I do
Yeah,
think as we sit and talk about um, engagement around issues like the climate crisis and
yeah,
the challenges to um, biodiversity and nature that we are facing, which is so kind of overwhelming for people.
yeah.
What do you think
Well,
Connie might do in this space for the Wellcome Trust?
yeah, I mean, our thinking or my thinking on this was sparked by some conversations with some others in the US, who were looking at how do you create a connection between senior execs in their statements, their formal statements around sustainability commitments. How do you create a sufficient connection that they're actually minded to stick with them rather than roll back from them? And is there a role for using characterization or some other behavioral mechanism to do that? And it got me thinking around this, and it really opened up some other questions of, well, actually, what we've created here isn't something that is purely looking at, ethics and compliance. We're asking the question, what would Connie do? And that talks to any number of behaviors or difficult choices or decisions you have to make. And there are many other areas across the business that we can apply that to. And so one that we're working on at the moment and we'll be looking at is using Connie to try and help embed decisions around making sustainable choices for our staff. So how can we encourage when picking a mode of transport to travel with, or whatever the choice happens to be within our office environment? How can we provoke the question that is, what would Connie do? Well, how do you pause, think, and make the thoughtful choice?
Mm.
And those same questions that we ask around beliefs and values, risks, what would your colleagues think, what would the public think, does it feel right, can apply in so many different settings. And so we can have fun. We can literally turn Connie green for sustainability. But I think there are a whole bundle of areas that you can start integrating that.
Fantastic. I've got a couple of questions coming in from the Q&A,
Mm.
which I'll just touch on now, Fraser. The first one is your code publicly available from Stephen Kerry?
It's a good question. We don't publish it on the website. We should. Um, it's there's we don't hide anything in it, and it's relatively short. So yeah, maybe I'll look into making sure we do that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And then a question from Paul Merton, which is, was there a danger that using a Sesame Street style puppet and humor could trivialize, sorry, the ethics message?
Yeah, I mean that was the key risk that I was worried about. I think there is a real danger, and I think there's a balance to get right. So I think if we'd created a Cookie Monster kind of creature that was very childish, uh, absolutely that would have been a problem. So we were very careful in designing out out our character. You may not be able to see it, but I'll show you on the screen. That's the original design, which the Hara, who was our art designer, and James and I created over a Teams call in about 40 minutes. But the starting point was to define out what we wanted people to feel through an engagement with this character. So those are the words around the edge, and that then
I love those.
translated.
And they're kind of values, are they all
They
values?
they they,
Yeah.
they could well be, but yeah,
Yeah.
we
Okay.
defined them as how do we want people to feel, and
Feel. I
as a
love that.
result, yes, you can absolutely create a childish puppet, but you can create a professionally engaging one, and a lot of the
Yeah.
inspiration, and of course for copyright reasons, we certainly would never have copied any of the Henson work, but was around the sorts of feels that the likes of Kermit might make you feel. And
Yeah.
it was always very professional and engaging. And it was how we designed that out. And I think it's really important to invest in that, because otherwise, yes, there is a real danger that you create something silly that's trivial and that people don't engage with, and that undermines what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioning Kermit because Connie seems much more on Kermit than the kind of other Sesame Street characters. It's kind of Kermit had that kind of uh, helpful, way of explaining and expanding on things in quite a clear way within Sesame Street. Yeah.
And yeah,
Okay.
and something else I don't think would work,
No.
or
And then the final question that we've had in through the Q&A was it a challenge to get this scheme approved within the organisation? And if so, what would you say was the most successful point in making this happen? It's a great question.
It's a great question. And again, I'm not naive enough to think that this would be easy in every organization, because it's very hard to go off track in any organization. So it requires people to take a bit of a leap of faith with you. My top tip was to root this in the changes we were trying to drive and the behavioral science that would enable that. So to win the buy-in for the approach before introducing the mechanism. I think had I started out by saying, folks, I've got this great idea, we're going to create a puppet about ethics, I'd have probably been laughed out of the door. But
Great.
actually,
So
to be able to
grounding it.
say, yeah, what we want to do is increase engagement. The behavioral science tells us we can do this through these ways. We're exploring this. And only then and here's the mechanism. I think that becomes the convincing line of argument.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that answers the next question that we've just had in, which is, what are your biggest tips for making a business case for incorporating puppets into ethics communication?
Well, I'd also, though, just picking up on that, say this isn't, don't tell Connie, this isn't about the puppet. This is about the thinking behind
How
it.
can you say that?
And
Connie is really upset now.
but it could equally be that what would work in your organization was a series of cartoons or a song or a flash mob doing a dance in the lobby. Who knows what the creativity and therefore the method is. It doesn't have, it's not actually about the puppet. It's about the mechanism that resonates with your people.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, look, Fraser, we're going to draw it to a close. I just want to say personally, I think the bravery that you've shown in this campaign and the excellence in the execution of Connie and just the kind of human-centered approach that you've taken to this whole project is inspiring. So thank you. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us and sharing your work and explaining it so clearly in such an inspiring way. I really hope it has encouraged people listening in to become more creative in their approach to ethics. Thank you so much.
Complete pleasure, and really hope it does inspire some people. And if it does, really look forward to seeing what that might be. And if anyone wants to reach out directly, I'm sure you can find my contact details on LinkedIn, and very, very happy to connect further.